I want to thank everyone for joining us here again for another Matthews Reads Earthsea. This is where we've been doing a little bit of like a podcast format of breaking down all the chapters for A Wizard of Earthsea. And today's episode, we'll be doing chapters 5 through 7. So if you wanted to follow along, make sure you've at least read up to there because there will be some spoilers. And I'm joined here with our marketing manager, Megan. Megan, thank you for joining me here today.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Yeah. So would you like to give us, me and the audience, a little bit of a chapter rundown on the, let's see, the 3 chapters that we would have had read for today?
Yep. All right. So where we left off the last time, Ged was just leaving Roke. And so after Roke, Ged takes up residency in the 90 Isles, providing the villagers there protection from dragons that have seized and taken up residence on the nearby island of Pandora. But he discovers that he is still being sought by the Shadow. Knowing that he cannot guard against both threats at the same time, he sails to Pandora and gambles his life on a guess of the adult dragon's true name. When he is proved right, the dragon offers to tell him the name of the Shadow, but Ged instead extracts a promise that the dragon and his offspring will never again threaten the archipelago. Chased by the Shadow, Ged flees to Osgil, having heard of the Stone of Terranon from a mysterious stranger. He's attacked by the Shadow and barely escapes into the court of Terranon. Surette, the lady of the castle, shows him the stone and urges Ged to speak to it, claiming it can give him limitless knowledge and power. Recognizing that the stone harbors one of the old power's ancient, powerful, malevolent beings, Ged refuses. He flees and is pursued by the stone's minions, but transforms into a swift falcon and escapes. Ged flies back to Ogion on Gaunt. Unlike Gensher, Ogion insists that all creatures have a name and advises Ged to confront the Shadow. So
Well
there
done.
it is.
Thank
in a
you.
very brief little section.
There's a lot going on in these 3 chapters.
There
in
is.
fact, before we even get started, I'd like to say that of the entire book, both times that I've read this, now before and after or during our program, yeah, these are my 3 favorite chapters. I feel like this is like the bulk of the book. This, to me, like these 3 chapters are what solidified this book for me as like an actual successful read and like a book that just actually meant a lot to me, especially the first chapter, The Dragons of Pandora. That was a really cool chapter.
It's a really cool chapter. And I think the way we broke this discussion up, having it, first doing 1 through 4 and now doing 5 through 7, we really did break right at the part where there's also a break in the novel of who Ged is and the type of person he is. Because when you go and, you're introduced to Ged in chapter 1, and he's this kind of rebellious, super headstrong, egotistical guy who's just rearing to go all the time, wants to do more and more and more, wants to be more and more powerful. And in chapter 5, Ged is not any of those things anymore. I mean, he's just a completely changed person from the events that happened in chapter 4 with when the Shadow is introduced. And that really struck me when at the very beginning of chapter 5, he meets the villagers for the first time. And the villagers describe him as a strange young grim fellow who spoke little, but spoke fairly and without pride, which is not at all how anyone would have described him in the first 4 chapters.
No, it kind of highlights just how bad of an encounter he had with that Shadow. Like you were saying, like you don't really realize just how many pegs that Shadow really knocked him down, and his last year at his school like really matured him up. And yeah, it is like a completely different character that you're getting in these chapters compared to when he was first going to school on the island of Roke.
It's like that idea of deconstruction. I think that Ged had to almost completely deconstruct who he is and go to the bottom of, not having pride, not having confidence, because that's kind of who we see for a little bit, is this very nervous, scared, anxious. He mistrusts his power. He mistrusts his abilities. And this is like, he's like gone down that, and now he's building it up again, but in a way that is sustainable, responsible, full of wisdom. That's what I think we see over these 3 chapters.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, it's a good thing, because in these 3 chapters, he's no longer in his school anymore and can't really
Yeah.
be protected by his teachers. And it's the first time you're actually seeing him. Well, I mean, at the beginning, you get to see a bit of a quest of him getting to the school. But in these 3 chapters, you're really getting that, like, like we've got the Bellman coming up of the hero's journey. And like, you're starting to actually see him have to go on this real journey now that he's done with school. So that chapter 5 of him going to Pandora is a really pivotal time in the book, where he goes from just a student at the wizard school to now, like, which, by the way, I really like how they describe that in the book, where there's almost like a wizard graduation program where they send these wizards to like specific areas where these areas actually need help. And I like how in this fantasy world, like, the wizards who graduate from Roke are placed in like communities to like help the communities,
Yes.
and it's just like a really, once again, going back to like how much we've all been appreciating Ursula, the author of this book. But just, I mean, it's one thing to have like wizards go to a wizard school, but to take it even further and kind of describe the process of after they graduate from school and how they're placed in these islands, for me was like really, really innovative and fun to learn that there's more to it than just you're a wizard.
For sure. And what's really interesting is the Archmage even says, when he places Ged at these islands, he says that this is a job that doesn't have any fame or glory to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not a job that probably a newly graduated wizard would really want. But Ged was willing to take it because I think in the book it says he doubted his strength and dreaded the trial of his power. So just really, again, like, we're seeing that he doesn't need something that's going to build up his pride. He doesn't feel like he needs that. His motivations have just completely changed from when he was in school. And now he's almost shying away from having to do stuff that would require him to immediately show a lot of power.
Yeah. It's like he wants an easier life and is like fine with going down to this tiny little island nation and just chilling out. But that doesn't happen, because the shadow finds him yet again. Now, there was one thing in this chapter that I never quite I mean, I get it, but I don't. And it's, there's the scene with Peckberry, the seaman or the fisherman who's actually got a child who's sick, and Ged's trying to help him, doesn't work out, has a problem with the shadow again, and then just decides, well, I better go check out the dragons on this island. I got a little confused both times on what really motivates him to go, I need to get out of here, and first I need to go check these dragons out. Was it just because he wanted to leave the place safe, or?
Well, yes. In a roundabout way, yes. So one thing I find really interesting about his attempt to save Ewick,
Lotorni?
that is his
the kid.
Ewick?
It was some of these names, folks, they're tough. Just
we're doing
skip
the best
them if
we
you
can,
can't.
everybody.
Yeah, if you don't know how, you just make it up as you go along.
I'm gonna go with Ewick.
That works.
When he tries to save him, this is the first time. So he's basically kind of doing what he has done, in that he's chasing down like a spirit of a person, which is it's similar to, I think, what we saw in the beginning when he read out of the book of spells and he tried to bring that spirit back to life. And then again, in
he
school,
goes into that realm, right?
Yes, it's like that same realm, but this time he does it not out of any sort of like prideful wanting to like show himself to be this amazing wizard, and he does it genuinely to just save this person out of the goodness of his heart, and he even is scared to and doesn't really want to, but because it says in the book, and we all know that Ursula is very transparent with motivations. She makes sure we know motivation.
Yeah.
And she writes, with no thought for himself, he sent his spirit out after the child's spirit to bring it back home. So he knows that this is a dangerous thing to do. And so when that happens, the shadow is able to find him once again. So it's not just that the shadow is looking for him. The shadow now knows where he is because he did this. And so what Ged realizes is that him being on this island and the shadow knowing where he is a danger to the villagers on that island, because the shadow is going to seek him out, and anywhere he is dangerous to the people around him. And so, but he also knows that to leave and leave them helpless against these dragons would also be dangerous. So he feels this pull of, if I stay, it's dangerous. If I leave, it's dangerous. For them, the only way that I can fix this and keep everyone safe is for me to just confront them, because he even says, I must leave this place. I am in danger and I put you in danger. I must go. Therefore, I ask your leave to go out and do away with the dragons on Pandora, so that my task for you will be finished and I may leave freely. Or if I fail, I should fail also when they come here, and that is better known now than later. So basically, he's just like, it's a like of no consequence if I go there and die, because I would have died when they came to fight anyway, and at least then they can get someone else to protect them, and they're still going to be safe. So he literally completely selflessly, which again, way to go, Ged, decides to seek out these dragons, because in his mind, in his rationale, this is just going to be the safest thing for everyone involved, other than himself.
Yeah, Get definitely gets a lot cooler in this chapter. I mean, that alone, just the the notion that he's aware of other people is something sort of new and really cool. But transitioning to the rest of that chapter, I think my favorite part about the whole concept of the Dragon Island was the description, and how Ursula describes this kind of little beat up island, and how, she describes, he thought he was looking at a tower the whole time, and the tower moves, and it was the dragon, or the main dragon, Yavad. That to me was like one of the coolest scenes in the book, where that like demonstrated not only is her themes and her ideas really cool, but she's also just that great of a writer, that like the suspense of, he's sitting there battling all these like baby dragons, and he's looking for the big one, and then this tower moves. Like I could just see it in my head, and was like, oh, that was so did you enjoy these chapters as much as I did? Like, what were your thoughts on the actual entertainment of it?
So I really enjoyed chapters 5 and chapter 7. 6 was a little slower for me, because 6 almost feels like a transitionatory chapter between 5 and 7. And so, which I guess 6 would be the transition chapter. It's kind of a stupid thing to say.
But no, I know what you mean. That one of these 3 is not as big.
It feels like big events happen in 5, big events happen in 7, and 6 is wrapping up everything that happened in 5 and setting up what's about to happen in 7.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, although I guess to be fair, there is in chapter 6, there is the confrontation finally between the shadow and Ged. And I guess I can't discount that, because that is quite, and Ursula is very dark in her description of that, but I don't want to jump ahead too much, because I know we're going to get there soon. I did want to touch back on one thing with him facing the dragons. Because again, this is just really Ursula showing us how much Ged is willing to put others first, because the dragon offers to tell him the name of the shadow. And kind of like strike a deal. Yes, and tries to kind of use his selfishness. I think the dragon is trying to use his selfishness against him, so that Ged will get something that he wants, that'll save himself, leave the dragon alone, and then the dragon can still go about his life, still be a threat to the villagers, go over there and eat some people if he wants to. But instead, Ged doesn't fall for it, and instead is like, I don't care that you can tell me the name of the shadow. I care more about other people's safety. He gets tempted twice in this chapter, in this book, this section, not to skip ahead, but in the Hawk's Flight, some of the people like Surette at the castle tempt him, and like both times you're kind of not sure what he's going to say, because he's still just a kid, and kind of passes both with flying colors. But I also love how he for starters, I know last time you and I during this breakdown was really trying to highlight the importance of names,
and why
Mm-hmm.
names are important in this magical world. And in this chapter, it's like you get to finally see it in sort of action format where Ged figures out the name of the dragon, and just by saying the dragon's name, which he kind of pulls out of his head just from remembering from reading through all those books at school.
That's why you do your
And
homework, kids.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like knowledge was truly power this time. Had Ged not like studied his homework, he'd probably be eaten by a dragon. But yeah, he says the dragon's name and the dragon just freezes and is like, you win. What are your demands? Like, so for those following along, now you kind of see why in the beginning or in a lot of our programming and whatnot, we've, you know, the naming aspect in this world is huge, which I can't give this away yet because it would be a spoiler for the book, but had the dragon, like, I guess, because I don't want to get too much into it because it's sort of a spoiler to the end of the book, but had the dragon actually said the Shadow's name, that could have been really bad for Ged. So that whole aspect was really interesting to me. But just the fact that you finally, you know, as a reader, get to not only see some action, but how naming is important and how in this world magicians or wizards, I should say, actually fight, since it's the first time you're seeing Ged in true action when he's taking down those dragons. I also like that she added in there that dragons hate water, and just she gave them characteristics, and that was just more praise to Ursula for that.
I hadn't even thought about the fact that, again, trying not to go through too many spoilers, but I hadn't even thought about the fact of the consequences of the dragon saying the Shadow's name.
Yeah,
that would have been immediate to Ged in that moment. Ged even mentions that, you know, the deals the dragons make usually aren't in the person's best interest. And in this one, you're right, it would not have been. Like in one way, Ged would have gotten what he wanted, but there would have actually been a consequence as well.
Those dragons are sneaky.
Ooh.
Yeah. But it also makes me wonder, because, you know, like Wizard of Earthsea is the first of, I think, 6 or 7 books. I wouldn't be surprised if Yavad, the main dragon, if he makes a return in the series, and that would be interesting. Just since Ged lets him live, you know, it makes you wonder if, in fact, I actually kind of thought Yavad would make another appearance in our book in this particular one, which he didn't. But just getting that little bit of dragonness in the book was just fun for me to read, and fun to know, you know, like our readers are finally getting to get into the heat of the quest.
For sure.
Yeah.
But
which brings us into kind of the slower of the 3, but what did you think of the magic wind and how it wouldn't let him back on Roke Island?
I thought, you know, there's so much in this chapter, I feel like, that is pointing to this idea that Ged is very isolated. He's starting to become more isolated, and he's being alienated from any community that he had grown close to. And so he has to leave the villagers, even though he actually had kind of created a community there and trust and friends. And then when he tries to go back to Roke, this other place that he has a community with, he's not able to, because it senses that evil shadow that is, you know, connected to him. And so it won't let him come in, because it won't let anybody, it won't let anything evil within its boundary. And so, yeah, it's, and I think that this sense of isolation really is something we see for the next couple of chapters. So that was one thing I think that really stood out to me reading this chapter.
Yeah, he's had a pretty rough life, and then to throw in what happens in, like, you know, with the child in chapter 5, and it's like he was just getting used to being in that low Torning area when he was right out of school, and then between the shadow, the dragon, the kid dying, and now he's already back on his own. That's a good point. I hadn't really thought of that. Adds to his.
And to me, the shadow is constantly trying to isolate Ged as much as
Yeah.
possible,
It wants
because
him.
even when he is taken over Skyor,
Yeah.
Skyor or Skior,
Skiror.
and he isolates. He tells him he'll take him to Terranon, and he isolates Ged from the rest of the group to take him to Terranon. And that is when the shadow begins to chase him, where he reveals himself to be the shadow and begins to chase him. You know, I think that there's maybe this idea that Ursula's saying, you know, the more isolated we are from community, the weaker that we become. And that community is very important. And I don't think she just means community with other people, but I think she also means community with other animals. Because even like the his
Otek?
his Otek, his Otek is actually what saves Ged's life if we go back to chapter 5, by waking him up and licking. I think did he lick his
Yeah.
face or something like
Licks his
that?
face, and that's when he realizes there's a connection with animals.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And so I think that there's this idea of you have to be in community with everything around you. And when Ged is feeling isolated, he begins to feel more and more powerless, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that was also pretty crazy that the shadow is able to like possess other people now too, as he learns, like when Skiro's following him off the island. And but I mean, other than that, I mean, there wasn't really much else from this chapter that I jotted down. I mean, I do like that they get into a little bit more. I remember, you know, when I was reading this the first time, something that caught me in this was they talk a lot more about wizards and their staffs and like
Yeah.
the importance there. And so that was really the only other thing that I had jotted down on this particular chapter, is that, you know, he runs into that the guy in the gray, the sort of strange, mysterious man in the gray that kind of suggests maybe you go to Terranon, and he was wondering why he didn't have a staff, and it kind of goes into more about why wizards need their staffs and like how to kind of tell which type of wizard's which, with or without his staff. So that was really the only other thing that I had jotted down from that chapter.
I think the only other thing that I thought was interesting is just Ursula's description of the shadow being constantly, when it's chasing Ged, it's consistently just a step behind him. And so it's almost like the shadow isn't ever catching Ged, but Ged also can't distance himself from the shadow either during that scene. And so I thought that was really an interesting kind of vision, mostly just because that's how shadows work in real life. And so again, I think it points to the symbolism of, you know, just an inner struggle, that inner darkness and lightness and things, which I think we'll probably end up talking a lot more about in the next podcast.
Definitely.
So I'll save some of that discussion for later.
Right. It's hard to talk about the shadow without getting too into it. But at this point, you know, you're really starting to, it was at this point for me where I really started to have a legitimate guess of what I thought that shadow was going to be and some of the secrets behind it. Because in the first, I mean, your first few times you're introduced to the shadow, I was kind of just like, okay, I don't get this. Other than I get it's a shadow, but there seems to be more to it. It's always around when he's by himself or going through hard times. So I think in chapter 6, it sort of starts clicking of maybe where she's trying to take this. This is where, like, I had people in other book clubs start to get legit guesses on what they thought the shadow was, and a lot of them guessed right. So if you're reading this and you got through where we're reading right now, you know, maybe now's time to start guessing what you think this shadow's going to end up being and how Ged's going to be able to beat it. So he goes to this, let's see, is the place called Terranon? Yeah. And kind of runs into some pretty suspect characters in this castle.
Yes. Well, I mean, I really enjoyed her description of it. It reminded me a lot, like if I were to envision it, it reminded me a lot of Rivendell
in
Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And especially in the films. Um, and so just, thinking about this really bright light space. However, unlike Rivendell, um, there's kind of this sense to it, the way it's described, that even though it's bright and light and full of servants, Ged still feels very alone and very isolated. And he describes how, even though it was full of light, his mind never seems to clear. And so it's almost like there's this darkness that's there as well.
It's always cold.
Yes, it's always cold. And he never really feels a strong connection to anybody. And so I felt like kind of that whole idea of, again, isolation continues, that even though he's around other people, plus his Otak is gone at this point.
Yep, and has no idea where he's at.
Yeah, that's a huge connection for Ged. So to no longer have that, I'm sure it's really difficult. Oh yeah, and it also says that Ged is often filled with a cold shame. And he says to Surratt, "I had power once, I've lost it, I think." So he's just, I feel like this is almost like he's hit rock bottom at this point.
Yeah, he's just kind of stuck in this weird castle. He's cold. He does the same stuff every day. He talks about, kind of being bored in there, and he knows he's like safe-ish from the shadow, but it's kind of like everywhere where even if he gets away from the shadow, then he knows it's just waiting for him right outside. So you can really start to get the sense that he's getting super restless about this thing, which kind of is what makes the shadow like the ultimate antagonist. Like, it really is the perfect villain, how it's just always looming behind him to where he can't clear his head or, physically or mentally escape. Just, it's constantly manifesting on him. And yeah, this chapter was pretty gloomy till he kind of starts meeting Surratt, and she ends up kind of being suspicious herself and is like really trying to get him to go grab this magic stone of Terranon. And he's just, once again, that was one of those times when she was kind of trying to tell him, like, with someone like your powers, if you grab the stone, the two of us could, which it is like, that's like evil people speech 101, is saying, if you grab that, we can rule together. So there was strike one. But what's crazy is it took me the second time to read it where I realized, oh, that's the girl from the beginning. I didn't draw that. So it's kind of funny now that he went from, she's the one that got him in trouble from the get-go and was trying to tempt him with, back when he was trying to be all showing off and cocky. So it was cool this time for him to tell her no, and he wasn't as tempted from her the first time.
Well, it's all very cyclical. It's almost like he had to go through all of those trials that he did to leading up to when he basically manifested the shadow through his pride and his arrogance. And now he's going through kind of some of those same trials again as a different person, a more wise person. And on this second try, he's actually succeeding to do the right thing. And that's what's slowly building up his character so that he's going to become this powerful wizard that we know that he is going to eventually become.
Yeah.
And I think him readdressing this temptation with Surratt that he once gave into, that started his whole struggle with the shadow, is that full circle of him going back, being kind of put in a very similar situation where, it's this idea that she can give him power and glory. And he now has the wisdom. There's this part where he asks the price for knowing the shadow's name, and Surratt responds with, "There is no price." But because Ged now has, I think, internalized what he's been told by Ogion and all the teachers at Rogue, that there is always cause and effect. There's always a price. There's always, if you do something here, that affects something over here. Ged is wise enough to know there's got to be a price. There's a price. Nothing is ever priceless.
Right. Yeah. And so you can just already see he's getting a little more clever with like people tempting him into his pride or ego or like whatever it is. Yeah.
I think that was a real clear example to me of like, oh, he's really internalized what he's learned. Way to go.
Yeah. First time he doesn't just jump to like, yeah, I can do that, or yeah, let me prove you wrong. Um, and then, he finds out that both Surette and the king of Terranon have been kind of conspiring against him. And it's kind of confusing though, because like Surette is conspiring against Ged, but also conspiring against the king, and the king is mad at Ged because he thinks he's teaming up with Surette, and it kind of just turns into a really confusing climactic ending to this chapter.
So yeah, there's a part, and I can't find it right now, where I think she's talking about whether or not she had touched the stone, and she said she had, and that it was fine, and that there was nothing to be afraid of. But Ged noticed that there was kind of like a sadness in her eyes, and I took that. I wondered if there's a part of Surette that is almost taken over by the power of the stone, and almost like some of the conspiring against Ged she's doing against her will. She's being used as a pawn by the stone and by the shadow to get Ged, when really that's not what she wants to do.
Right.
Because at the end, Ged rescues her and escapes, helps her escape just as she helps him escape. And so that's kind of one thing that I kind of picked up on, that I had some thoughts about, is maybe she's doing some of this not out of her own fruition.
It's kind of sad how she ends up dying too. Like how I didn't think they would, between her dying and then Ged's pet Otek, or what he names a Hoeg. This was one of those chapters where he was like, oh, they do kill off protagonists, or like main characters, or like big time characters. I didn't see that coming, and I can't remember. I think they're just called the Servers of Terranon, those like beasts that the evil king kind of summons. That once again was another really cool chapter for me, of like, you get to see Ged turn into an animal, you get to see him fight off some bad guys, and he gets some revenge for his pet. And it was another high fast-paced scene that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and and it's obvious that Ged is trying to help Surette escape, and she's the one who tells him to transform, isn't she?
Yeah, they both turn into birds. So she turns into a gull, and he turns into a falcon. And what's crazy too, what I'd like to add about the falcon is, he turns into this falcon and escapes, but it's where he, it's a good thing he flies back to his master Ogion, because Ogion recognizes this falcon and is like, hey, I know that falcon, and turns Ged back into a human. But it goes back into sort of this law that these wizards have to live, where if you turn into this animal for longer than you should, you start to forget what you actually are. And so Ged nearly becomes a falcon for good. But back to this structure of the hero's journey, I love this part where he comes back to his master, kind of gets healed up, and then Ogion gives him, just one of the coolest speeches. It basically says, look, you've taken down dragons now, you've taken down, you've fended off, you've now fought an evil king and these weird beings that he summoned, like, you can take on a shadow. It pretty much tells him, you need to quit going from the hunted to the hunting, go from that transition, and leaves him. And then Ged leaves with one of the coolest last lines, where he just leaves Ogion a little note that says, I go hunting. And it just is like that part in the book or movie where the heroes building up the final battle, and he now kind of realizes that, you're right, I do have all the skills and I know what I need to do, and I just need to go do it. And that just a cool little way to tie up this section of chapters that we read.
And I feel like that's so relatable, because how many of us really don't have the confidence to do something that we need to do until like a mentor of ours says something like, you know what, you're ready. I've seen you from the beginning. I've seen the evolution that you've gone through, and you can do this. I have no doubt in you. You're ready to face this. And I think that's really what Ged needed, is he needed someone who has known him since he was a small boy, who has known him when he was at his most arrogant, who was always slow to give him praise, slow to bolster him up, because Ojian always felt like he needed to learn humility and wisdom. And now Ojian is telling Ged, you can do this. You're stronger than you think. And so yeah, I just think that was such a relatable part of this. And honestly, this whole storyline is, even though it's a fantasy story, I feel like it's actually one of the more relatable storylines, because sure enough, in our adult life, we don't go on and fight dragons, but he leaves school, he's faced with all this self-doubt, he has a lot of immediate things that happen that just make him feel like he's in over his head. And it finally takes one of his mentors to help him figure out, like, no, you can do this. You're growing. You're on the right track. You're stronger than you think. And I think for so many of us that have graduated from college or high school, we've entered the workforce, we have, those first few years can just be really brutal, and you don't feel like you're doing anything right, and you just don't have the confidence. And it takes people who've known you telling you you're doing great, you're doing a good job sometimes, to really bolster you up. And so I think that this hero's journey, this story of growing from boy to adult, is just, it's an extremely relatable one for a fantasy novel, even in today's world.
That's really well put. I like that it's like you said, exactly, like anytime we go through big transitional times in our lives, it's good to hear from, whether it's a parent or a coach or a boss, just give you the words of encouragement. And like you said, in chapter 6 and beginning of 7, he's kind of at his lowest low, and continues where now he's got, his pet's dead, this girl's dead. He just got through this weird part in his life where he was stuck in this castle. And yeah, now we're getting to see kind of the rise from, he's at his lowest low, and there's only one way you can go from there, and that's just go up. And so I think our readers are really going to like these last 3 chapters. You kind of see the final evolution of Ged. He goes from, like we brushed on at the beginning, where we're seeing him we saw him transition from kind of your cocky prodigy high school student to gets knocked down a few pegs, enters the workforce, and deals with some really hard times in these 3 chapters. And then these last 3 chapters is where you're finally going to see him just kind of go full mature mode, and it's his mission and he owns it. And it's going to hopefully go down and take care of work. But yeah, I really like where we're ending things right here, because it is just like setting up for the thing we've been waiting for this whole time is Ged versus the Shadow. I'm going to kind of turn away from the sun here, but yeah, I just, the way she structured this book, I don't know how, we'll find out here in a few weeks when we do our talk on the hero's journey. So I don't know how exact it is to like the archetypal, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, but we are kind of seeing it go in these loops now from, school, then he gets out, deals with some hardships, kind of works his way up, goes back down, and now he's got to finish out what he started, and kind of sets it all up there at the end for you.
For sure.
Yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to add before we kind of end things here today? I know, like we were saying, these 3 chapters, there's a lot going on, so it's hard to get all the details in there, but I think we did a really good job of at least giving everybody a gist of what went down.
No, I think, I just think that this was a really great series of chapters, just to kind of witness Ged's growth. And it's just, it's just really cool. I feel like the way that Ursula laid out this book, like you said, and I think she was just very thoughtful about the whole thing. And you really can pinpoint each section of the novel as a different part of Ged's journey. And it's just very crystal cut, which I think makes this a book that's easy to understand, easy to relate to. Probably why it's such a popular young adult novel. So
right.
Yeah, I'm just really hoping that everyone out there who's reading it right now is enjoying it as much as I am.
Yeah, that's a good point to add. I hope all the people out here are picking up on this too, and just seeing why we chose this book. and it might kind of clear up, with some programming as well. But really, just once again, we keep saying it, but a lot of this just goes back to, I guess, our whole staff just appreciating what Ursula was doing. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. If you have not, make sure for this last section that we're going to be doing a podcast on, you read chapters 8 through 10 or 8 through the end of the book. Today's was 4 through 6, so just don't want to get ahead of anybody or make any spoilers. So make sure we're just reading along, and then hopefully by the time we do this next, we'll all have the book done, and we'll be able to just kind of do a rundown on the rest of it.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks for joining me here, Megan. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.